Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for yet another of our neurodiversity and wellbeing interactive sessions. In the previous two, we have looked at neurodiversity broadly, remote working, reasonable adjustments, inclusion, wellbeing, and more. But today we will be focusing exclusively on the Access to Work scheme run by the Department of Work and Pensions, which is available for individuals in the UK. It is a great initiative which has helped both individuals and companies alike to make the world of work and as a result, all-round life better for many people. For some people here today, you might already be familiar with it or have heard of it at least, whilst for some others, you might be wondering why it has been secret to you until now, or are still trying to figure out all the relevant details relating to it. Today though, we're not going to just simply present to you what access to work is and the benefits of it, although we will do that also. We are in fact going to do something a little different to make sure that everyone who is here today can go away knowing how the Access to Work process works, whether it be for yourself or for others. We are therefore going to try and make it as interactive as possible and not mean that we have to listen to yet another basic webinar. And how that will work will become clearer a little later. However, it will admittedly be a good idea to put out there what exactly Access to Work is. And to help us with that, I'm pleased to say that I'm joined by Joe Hattan from the RBLI, who is here today as a subject expert upon the Access to Work scheme, and Daniel Brooke, a workplace needs assessor, trainer, and consultant. Welcome both, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks very much.
All right, so yeah, thank you for joining us, like I said. As I'm sure your varied insights and expertise will be a big help today. And on that note, I'm actually going to turn to you first, Joe, if that's okay, because obviously the RBLI is no longer just for veterans and people within the armed forces. These days, it also supports people with disabilities and getting people into work. So with that in mind, I was wondering if you would be okay to tell us why the Access to Work grant exists and how it can help both employers and employees.
Yes, thanks, Ross, and thanks again for inviting me today. So I work for RBLI, as you said, and we have a contract to carry out the Access to Work scheme. The Access to Work scheme began in 1994 and supports members of the working population who have a long-term physical or mental condition or have a neurodiverse condition, for example, dyslexia. It can help employees by identifying and reducing barriers in the workplace and by providing support for the difficulties they experience due to their condition. To qualify for the scheme, you need to have a paid job or to be about to start or return to one, be over 16 and have a disability or health conditions, physical or mental, that makes it hard for you to do parts of your job or to get to and from work. It benefits employers by ensuring that employees have the support they need to manage their condition in the workplace. And in my experience, this should lead to happier and healthier employees who are, whisper it, likely to be more productive.
Thank you, Joe. So I think it's therefore very clear and quite simple to see that it's a comprehensive scheme which can help people in quite a vast array of different ways. It's one which aims to help people and, like you said, employers too. And with that in mind, I'm going to turn to you, Daniel, for the first time today, because you're a workplace needs assessor, and you're therefore a vital person who an employee will come to talk about their struggles in the workplace, regardless of whether they have been diagnosed as neurodivergent or not. And that means that finding resolutions for them is what you do, which can often be advising them to apply for the Access to Work grant. So through your own experience as a workplace needs assessor, how would you describe the work you do alongside the scheme and the impact it has, just to give an overview to our audience once again about the Access to Work scheme?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Ross, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar today. So I would say that my role really alongside the scheme would be to signpost individuals and organisations to the Access to Work scheme. So as a workplace needs assessor, I often advise individuals and organisations to apply for an Access to Work grant. And as part of the conversations that I have with line managers, I explain to them that they may need to support the individual through that process of making an application. especially if the individual is quite new into the role. They may not be aware of, you know, for example, who the main contact would be within their organisation. And also with the workplace needs assessment report that I write, in that I will provide information about what support I'm recommending. So that could be workplace coaching, for example, a program of that, or specific assistive technology. And the report will also include the cost of those recommendations, which would then need to be given to Access to Work in order for them to see how much those recommendations are going to cost. Just regarding individuals that haven't been formally diagnosed with a processing difference, if they have a similar processing difference, or they've gone through a screening process which indicates that they may have a processing difference, then I would say that they should still have a workplace needs assessment, and I believe can still receive funding support from the Access to Work scheme.
Can I just interject there? Would you like me to just answer that question, Ross? Because the answer is yes.
Yes, thanks, Jo.
Yeah, you don't have to have had a formal diagnosis. In terms of neurodiversity, you don't have to have had a formal diagnosis, and Access to Work will accept if you've done, for example, a short online test, or if a lot of the things that they describe, they recognise are neurodiverse traits. So they will accept those referrals, yeah.
Okay, so that's brilliant. It's very evident there from what you've both outlined that the Access to Work scheme is both a worthwhile process, and there's a lot of additional support alongside it, which runs in tangent with it. And I think it's also, you've also highlighted that it's very established and well equipped to help people, and also the companies who employ them. But now that we've got basically the overview of Access to Work out there for our audience, we're going to turn to the interactive element of today to showcase to everyone how the Access to Work scheme and the grant can actually be applied for, and together go through it, go through a bit of a story with everyone here today, with the audience in fact being in control of how it pans out. So in preparation for today, we have set up a public mind map within Ayoa, which we have shared with all of you, to create a pretend scenario of an individual who is about to go on their Access to Work journey. And that is what you're seeing in front of you on your screens now. At key points, it will be down to you, the audience, to vote and decide on the decisions of our imaginary individual, David, thus determining their route to Access to Work and consequently their experience as an employee. So in order to cast your vote at some key decision points in David's journey, all you've got to do is click on one of these option bubbles when we arrive at them in the journey, like I've done now. And then with the pop-up which appears, just click on the plus to cast your vote. And at the end of each of this section, we'll be able to determine which way David is going to go on his Access to Work journey. And to make sure that you can interact like I've just shown you, first of all, you'll have to make sure that you are logged into your free Ayoa account. And then you will need to open up this public mind map, the link to which we shared with you all, hopefully via email before today. And then, like I said, once you're within it, at the correct point, all you've got to do is click on one of the option bubbles and then give the thumbs up there to cast your vote to say which option you'd like to vote for. So I hope that's all clear, but if you do have any questions, please feel free to put it in the Q&A of Zoom and we can help you out with that. And to start things off, here on the left-hand side of our mind map is a bit of context about our make-believe story when it comes to David's Access to Work journey. So in this scenario, David has recently been successful in gaining new employment at a company. But his work will see him working from home. So he's going to be working remotely during this period, which is quite common for all of us. In the past, he has had a screening to see if he's got a neurological difference. Nothing was confirmed for sure, but he thinks he might have a neurological difference. And not to give away any spoilers for later on, but it does turn out to be dyslexia, which David has. He also doesn't know anyone at his new work, so he might feel a bit intimidated there. The only person he knows there is the HR member who conducted his interview. And the final bit of context is that David's new company is relatively small without a big budget. So it's no massive corporation. So now with the scene being set, I was just wondering, Joe, if anything of what I just described to you stands out to you when it comes to how the Access to Work scheme might be able to have an impact on what I just described. So for example, is there anything which you know straight away it will be able to help David and his company with?
So in this scenario, it's likely that the Equality Act would apply if he thinks he is neurodiverse. And the definition of a disability under the Equality Act is if you have a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on your ability to do normal day-to-day activities. And so if he was neurodiverse and subsequently diagnosed with dyslexia, then that definition would apply. If someone has a disability under that definition, then the employer has a duty to make reasonable adjustments if the employer is placed at a substantial disadvantage because of their disability, compared with non-disabled people or people who don't share their disability. And these adjustments apply for home workers as well. The Access to Work scheme can recommend support to reduce the impact of the identified disability, and this can include things like software, equipment, training, coaching, a support worker, and assistance to travel to or within work. And there is funding available to support these recommendations. Examples of items that have been funded through the scheme include things such as specialist chairs, speech recognition software, handheld video magnifiers, and wireless microphones that enhance the functionality of hearing aids.
Okay, thank you, Joe. That's really good to know, because it tells us a little bit more about the Access to Work scheme and show how it also covers a lot of bases, considering all the differences which individuals and employees might have. And I was just wondering about yourself, Daniel, considering your role as a workplace needs assessor. With our scenario with David and what I just described, is it a situation which you are familiar with and you quite often deal with when people come to see you?
So yes, it is. I mean, I work with a lot of I've worked with a lot of individuals that haven't known for sure whether they have a processing difference. They may have just been through a screening process which has given them an indication. And I would say that actually there are a lot of people who are unaware of why they're experiencing certain challenges in the workplace. So I've worked with individuals who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, who have gone through education and their processing difference hasn't been spotted or diagnosed. They've also may have had lots of previous positions that were really well aligned to their strengths, and they've been able to develop good coping strategies for their challenges in those roles. And then now that they're coming into a new role, some of their challenges are now coming to the surface because they don't necessarily have the coping strategies for those challenges at the moment. So what I would say about this really is that it's important for organisations to have a really clear process of support in place, so that if individuals believe that they could be neurodivergent, that they can access screening, do a screening test. Also, the organisations are providing awareness training. I didn't find out that I was dyslexic until my early 30s, and that was because I went to an awareness session, and when the individual was delivering their presentation, a lot of the challenges that they were talking about resonated with me. So I think that's really important. The other thing just to point out here as well is that because of the overlapping nature of processing differences, it can actually be quite difficult for people to get a formal diagnosis. And if organisations aren't funding that for individuals, it is quite expensive for them to fund that themselves. And just my last point on this, really, apologies if I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but a diagnosis is required for individuals to receive support during study. So some individuals may come into the workplace and already have had some specialist study support, but won't have had workplace support before. But a diagnosis isn't necessarily required for them to get support in the workplace.
Okay, thanks for that, Daniel. I think what you've shown there is that how complex these things can be, and sometimes they get passed over. Like you said, you've talked to people of a lot older age, and it turns out that they have been neurodivergent, and it sort of emphasizes why it warrants specialist advice and support, which are of course worthwhile. So I think that nicely sets out the context for our imaginary journey we're about to set off on. I must admit it isn't the most enthralling Lord of the Rings or Hobbit style adventure, so regrettably there won't be any dragons, which I can promise, but it is important nevertheless. So we're just going to head over to the right side of the mind map now and see how David's first day pans out with his new job. So due to working from home, David is sent a company laptop for him to set up, plus some instructions on how to do so, along with instructions for the specific software and accounts he will need in order to do his work. However, these instructions are solely in a written form. Also, in order to work from home, David scrambles to set up to form a working space with what he has in his house, with no support from his company. Now, this is a bit of an unusual first day for David due to the remote working situation we're all facing. But I think I'd be right in saying that some of the processes here could have been done better by his company to make them more accessible and inclusive. I think, Daniel, you probably have the most expertise when it comes to this. So would you agree with that statement?
Yes, definitely. And I think that you know, one of the things that organisations can do right at the beginning is actually have a conversation with the individual and ask them what do they need, what's worked well for them in the past. So whether they're aware or not, whether they're neurodivergent, the individual may have come across some really good software that's helped them in the past. They might be using screen overlays if they have visual processing differences. They may have used noise cancelling headphones, for example, in the past. So I think an initial thing to do that works really well is just to really have a conversation with the individual to say, what is it that you need that helps you work well? And in this specific example where the individual is being given lots of information in a written format, I think that organisations should be aware of supplying that type of information so that it's accessible to everyone. So individuals that are dyslexic are more likely to be able to follow that information more easily if, for example, there's 1.5 line spacing or the font size is 12. They may be able to follow that information more easily if there's photos and pictures, diagrams, if they're somebody that likes to see things visually. And if in this scenario that we're talking about now, David gets distracted easily, it's really important that he receives the right support for his specific set of challenges. And I think the one point to sort of really get across here is that a person-centered approach to providing support is absolutely crucial, and that a one-size-fits-all approach is not appropriate. So it's really important that organisations provide specific support for individuals.
Yeah, definitely. I think you hit the nail on the head with being able to have conversations with people and also be mindful and have an open mind to differences which people might have, and just be able to accommodate for them so everything is as accessible as possible. And that's some improvements which could have happened on David's first day in this scenario. But nevertheless, David is now set up for work. However, he went about it in his own way. And we can say that he's enjoying his first week if we move down to this yellow and orange section here. However, whilst he's working from home, he instantly recognises that whilst having to communicate via digital means, that he's struggling. He also notices that he is more distracted than normal, despite nobody actually being around, potentially due to being in a relaxed environment, which is familiar to him with so many distractions available, and the whole of the internet being there for him just to access and roam through. So overall, during David's first week, this has made him aware yet again of the symptoms of dyslexia due to his current situation, and has resulted in a renewed suspicion for him that he might himself be dyslexic. He knows that this could be what is hampering his work, and he doesn't want his new colleagues to wrongly think that he is a poor worker, especially when he's trying to make a good first impression. And this leads us to David's first decision, which we're calling on our audience to determine. So it's completely unknown whether David will seek a diagnosis as yet or not, but he would like to, we would like to find out whether he is going to do so. If so, if you'd like to vote for option A, please firstly click on it and then press the thumbs up like I showed you earlier, or option B, again, just click on the bubble and then the thumbs up, and we'll find out in a second or in a few moments if we're voting for the first or the second option, which will either be a yes or a no. Okay, apologies about that. I've just got a message through from our support team saying the thumbs up and the thumbs down doesn't seem to be working for people. So this admittedly is going to be a bit of a problem with what we're trying to do today, but we can nevertheless carry on with the storyline. So maybe we'll split it up and we'll give Daniel the first vote, and then for the next option we'll turn to Joe for the second one. So Daniel, it's completely down to you. What would you like to vote for? Would you like to vote for option A or option B?
So I'm going to go for option B, if that's okay.
Option B, okay. So no, we're not having, David has decided so far not to seek a diagnosis to see if he is neurodivergent. So I was just wondering, especially as you've ended up voting for this option, Daniel, what the pros and the cons would have been regarding this decision, especially thinking that David hasn't taken the decision to make a diagnosis, and how that might continue to affect his work, not knowing that he has a neurological difference?
Yes, so I think that this sort of poses a question really on whether a diagnosis is actually needed in order for David to receive workplace support. And as Joe and I were discussing at the beginning, a diagnosis isn't necessary for that. And I think one of the other sort of questions that comes from this is whether or not David is going to be required to study alongside his job. So there are lots of individuals that are in roles where they are required to gain formal qualifications in the role that they're in, and will continue to study alongside work. So if David was required to undertake study, then my answer would have been different. I would have gone for option A, because David wouldn't be able to receive any study support, or may not be able to receive study support if he hasn't had a formal diagnosis. And the other thing is that a diagnosis may help David understand his challenges, but it won't necessarily explain how these may display themselves in the workplace and what impact that could have on specific work tasks. So I would say that possibly the next step for David would be undertaking a screening to give an indication of whether he has a neurodivergent condition or not. And I would say that regardless of whether he has a diagnostic assessment and he is diagnosed or not, he should have a workplace needs assessment anyway, because he's displaying similar challenges, and he would need the workplace needs assessment to take place so that specialist support can be given to him.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that regardless of whether David has a diagnosis or a screening or not, he could still seek a workplace needs assessment. And basically the benefit of having a diagnosis is that it gives more context, and it means that he could understand, or people could get a better understanding, including himself, of how he can go about working in a better way. But if we sort of take back hold of the situation and pretend now that David has in fact had a diagnosis, and it turns out that he is dyslexic, so we can keep moving forward with our pretend storyline and move on to the green section following David's diagnosis. We can say that David firsthand can assuredly and rightfully say that people with neurological differences are in no way less intelligent than anyone else, despite the stereotypes which still linger. However, this still leaves David with some extra thoughts to consider. And one of those is that negative perception, which does wrongly still exist in some occasions, is causing him some issues, because he is concerned about what people might think if he discloses his dyslexia to others. So this is would sort of lead us on to the next decision-making section for does David decide to have a workplace needs assessment and act on the advice which is given, if so, because it would result in him disclosing, or potentially going on to disclose, his neurological difference to his company. Unfortunately, the voting system isn't working currently, so I'm going to turn to Joe this time to see if you'd like to vote for option A or option B.
So I would vote option A, yes. He should have a workplace needs assessment.
Oh, okay. Option A has turned up being no, unfortunately. We're not doing very well for David. But nevertheless, so if David, in our current scenario, isn't going for a workplace needs assessment, Daniel, what would that mean that he would be missing out on, as you obviously engage with these very often in your line of work? And in your own experience, maybe with individuals who don't have an assessment until their later years, do you tend to find that they wish that they had gone for an assessment earlier?
Yes, in answer to the second question there, I think individuals that are a bit older and haven't had any specialist support before, when they do then actually have a workplace needs assessment, they do say to me, oh, I really wish that I had this in previous jobs, because I would have, you know, got some really good support. My challenges would have been more in my control. You know, these individuals have got promoted and they work really, really hard and they're very, very determined. But the kind of analogy that I use is that, you know, sometimes they feel like they're trying to keep afloat. So everyone else sees the great work that they do and that they're performing really well, but actually underneath the surface, they're kicking really hard. So underneath the water, they're kicking really hard to stay afloat as such. I've forgotten your first question, Ross. I'm so sorry.
That's all right. The first question was going to be what generally consists when you're doing a workplace needs assessment. So what might be the process which you go through for one?
Yes, okay, certainly. So, yeah, there are lots of important areas to cover when conducting a workplace needs assessment. And I think a first discussion point is really the background to why that workplace needs assessment is happening. So I have conducted workplace needs assessments for a number of individuals that, the reason that they're having a workplace needs assessment is actually because maybe their employer feels that they're not performing to standard, and maybe that their probation isn't going to get confirmed. And at that stage, the individual has then disclosed that they have a neurodivergent condition and that could be impacting upon their work performance. They may not have felt confident to do so beforehand because of past experience, for example. So it's really important that I understand why the individual is there in the room with me, really, and why they're having this workplace needs assessment. And the other thing to cover is, have they received any specialist support before? If the individual has, they may have used certain assistive technology or found that certain strategies have worked really well for them in the past, and therefore some of those strategies or some of those pieces of assistive technology, it might be appropriate for me to recommend those for the role they're in now, if it's going to help them with the specific challenges that they're experiencing now. Within the workplace needs assessment, you would also explore how the challenges are impacting on their work. So really sort of understanding, okay, what is the challenge? So if the challenge, for example, is challenges with focus and concentration and maintaining that, where does that actually show itself? So are you having challenges maintaining focus and concentration in meetings, for example, or is it when you're reading? And it could be a number of different scenarios, but it's important that the workplace needs assessor understands where that challenge is actually impacting upon the individual so that they can make appropriate recommendations. You would also explore what the individual's strengths are. Really, really important to discuss that. Some individuals that have a processing difference, they may not be aware that their processing difference, that there's a lot of related strengths related to that. So a lot of dyslexic individuals are, great big picture people, really very good at analytical work, really good at visualizing. So it's important to discuss with the individual what they see their strengths as being. And I think that can help some individuals gain a bit of confidence as well in their own ability, because even though they've got some challenges, they've also got a set of strengths alongside of those. And part of this process of having the workplace needs assessment is helping them bring their challenges into their control, so that, or more in control, so that their strengths can shine even brighter. And I would say that other things that I would cover is talking about the overlapping nature of processing differences. So if the individual, their primary processing difference is dyslexia, it's very likely that they're going to have, or almost certain actually, that they're going to have challenges that actually fall under some of the other processing differences. So just to explain that a little bit more clearly, so there's 7 co-occurring processing differences. You have dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, ADD, ADHD, and ASD, which is autistic spectrum disorder. So if an individual has a set of challenges that fall under dyslexia, they're going to have 1, 2, maybe more that fit in some of the other, that fit more neatly under the other processing differences. So that can help the individual understand themselves a little bit better and be more self-aware of why they're experiencing certain challenges. And then the other things that I would cover with them, and talk about is the emotional impact that their challenges is having on them, because if they haven't received any specialist support before and don't have good coping strategies in place, then they could very likely be experiencing quite a lot of stress and anxiety, may not be sleeping well at night. It could really be affecting their overall well-being. And then lastly, I like to give the individual a heads up on what recommendations I'm likely to be including in the report, and talk through those so that the individual is aware of what they're going to see in the report. You know, they may wish to do a bit of research on what those pieces of assistive technology are, for example, or what the coaching might entail.
Okay, cool. So obviously a lot to cover there, and making sure that everything is really thorough and finding the best solutions for those in employment. And if we briefly return to our made-up scenario here, and we right the wrong and pretend that David in fact actually did go for his workplace needs assessment rather than not doing so, otherwise we'd abruptly come to an end of our story. If I'm just going to turn back to yourself, Joe, is there anything which you would say David should keep in mind to potentially help himself and his company with his application, maybe when it comes to timeframes or the overall process of applying for access to work, maybe after a workplace needs assessment, if it is recommended?
So what I can do is just talk you through the actual access to work process and how that is, how the employee goes about that, if that's okay. So the process is self-referral, and it can be online, it can be by telephone or by post, and David would need to provide a workplace address and postcode, a name of a workplace contact who can authorise access to work payments, workplace contact, email address and phone number, his tax reference number if he's self-employed, and he'd also need to explain how his condition affects him at work, if he's getting any other help, what he thinks may help him, and it would also help his application if he had spoken to the employer about reasonable adjustments before he applies for access to work. Just as an aside, I actually completed the online form last night just to test the process without actually submitting it, and although I would describe myself as neurotypical, I estimate it took me about 5 minutes to complete the form, so it shouldn't be too difficult to actually go through that process. And once the form has been submitted, David would receive a phone call from Access to Work, and his referral will be sent to RBLI if a further workplace needs assessment is required. And so the process that we follow is that when we receive the referral, our coordination team make contact with David within 24 hours, and they make an appointment for the assessment, and the report from the assessment will be returned back to Access to Work within 8 working days.
Okay, cool. So a lot is done in a short space of time, really, to get all of this really important work done for David in this scenario or any other employee. But I think the crucial point which you really mentioned there, Joe, was that it must be initiated by the employee themselves for them to apply for the Access to Work grant. And in our scenario, with quite a lot of tweaking, because David didn't go for the diagnosis and he didn't go for the workplace needs assessment due to our votes, we could say that we have in fact arrived at a point where David has successfully applied for the Access to Work grant and purchased the support he's advised to attain, which has then, like you said, led to his company being reimbursed for it in some manner by the Access to Work grant. And then that sort of leads us down here to the purple section. So we can see that David is now finding his work far easier. His concentration has improved. He's less conscious about his output. He feels reassured that his company is supportive of him and will continue to be. And the company is also pleased because they know that David is enjoying his work more and that they are able to support him, and he is more productive as a result. So although David has successfully gone through his own access to work journey, he's now at a point where he's noticing that some of his colleagues might likewise be neurodivergent. And that leads him to his final decision, because he also recognises that the assistive software which he has been recommended to use by the Access to Work scheme in his workplace needs assessment could also be used by other members of his team, so that they can all collaborate together better, regardless of if they are neurodivergent or neurotypical. So Dave, with those two things in mind, David has one more decision to make. Does he introduce his assistive software to his colleagues and share with them his access to work journey, thus disclosing his neurological difference? So I'm going to return to you this time, Daniel. Would you like to vote for option A or option B?
Option A.
Option A. Okay, we've got a hat trick of no's. So we've gone for that option every single time. Joe, do you have any thoughts on this outcome with David deciding not to disclose his access to work journey with his colleagues, which might be able to benefit them?
Obviously, it's and Daniel sort of alluded to this. There's whether you disclose if you're dyslexic or neurodivergent, it's a very personal decision, and people have to. You have to respect if somebody doesn't want to disclose that decision. As Daniel was saying, when people are diagnosed later in their working life, unfortunately, a lot of them have experienced, unpleasantness from maybe colleagues and line managers because they have perceived their difficulties as perhaps laziness, and so therefore people at this point can be reluctant to disclose a dyslexia diagnosis if they've had a very negative experience in the past through lack of understanding. The other point to mention is that I recommended the Equality Act. I mentioned the Equality Act. This is a law, as I said, that protects individuals from discrimination. And it means that discrimination or unfair treatment on the basis of certain characteristics, such as disability, is against the law in most cases. So he shouldn't be concerned about disclosing his dyslexia from a sort of legal perspective, if you like, but it is a personal decision. In terms of referring or making other colleagues aware of the scheme, it's again, although some of the things he is using could benefit, if you like, in inverted commas, neurotypical individuals, those individuals, those colleagues would have to demonstrate to Access to Work and demonstrate that they do show neurodiverse traits to sort of benefit from the support that's put in place for him. The other thing is there is support for the wider team available as well. Daniel mentioned at the beginning that his own dyslexia was flagged up to himself because he attended an awareness session about dyslexia, and supporting dyslexia awareness sessions is something that Access to Work does, and also, as well as strategy coaching, which Daniel mentioned as well, you can involve the manager in coaching as well, which is called co-coaching, where the manager sits in on the coaching process, and it helps the manager or colleague to really have a good understanding of the difficulties that the individual is experiencing with the coach there to sort of mediate. But as you know, there are many reasons why people can apply to Access to Work, and being neurodivergent is one of them. And it enables barriers to work to be reduced and difficulties addressed. And for example, in 2018-19, Access to Work provision was approved for 32,000 people, and there were Access to Work payments made for 36,240 people in that same time.
Okay, so yeah, I think you made some really good points there, Joe. Thank you very much, especially how you're bringing in that it is, at the end of the day, a personal decision, and that should always be respected. But then also talking about how other people can go on like awareness courses and learn about coaching. It's not just a benefit to those employees who might be neurodivergent and could directly benefit from access to work, but also by just raising awareness to everyone, it means that the overall workplace will be a lot better. And I think that overall, despite David inadvertently making some decisions which didn't make it the easiest to go through the access to work journey, like we've shown at the very end, he did end up applying for it and getting the support he needed. So that sort of concludes our webinar today of going through the access to work journey, and hopefully along the way outlining to our audience today the overall process, dropping in some key facts about it as we go along. And we're now just in fact going to rest on this area here with some key facts about the access to work scheme, which you can see on your screen. And whilst people are looking through them, we're going to go to a Q&A section. So if you have any questions for Joe or David about the access to work process, or maybe workplace needs assessments, or anything about neurodiversity and helping employees, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A section in Zoom. I'm sure you're all familiar how to use Zoom now, with us all using it so often lately. Just literally go to the Q&A box and type in any questions you might have, and we'll be able to answer them for you now.
Ross, while people are thinking and submitting their questions, would you mind just going back to the last question that I answered no to? Because there's just a bit of information that I'd like to provide, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Lovely, thanks Ross. So where you've asked if David should disclose the use of his assistive technology and diagnosis to his colleagues, what I would say there is that he could actually talk to his colleagues about what assistive technology he's using without actually explaining why he has it. So he could explain to his colleagues that you know, he has certain challenges, but not that it's because of dyslexia or dyspraxia, for example. And I think what's really key about this is that individuals need to feel safe, that if they disclose that they're not going to be treated differently, and that they know that they're actually going to be supported. So that's one of the sort of reasons of initially saying no. And what I think is quite important is that individuals are able to assert what they need, but that they don't always have to say that it's because of a neurodivergent condition. So an example of that would be if an individual with dyslexia is asked to note take in a meeting, and because of their short-term memory challenges, and that the fact that they have a slower processing speed, for example, it's going to make doing that task quite challenging. So they could take a recording device into the meeting that is going to helpful for them. So the individual, rather than needing to explain to everybody within that room, within the meeting, that they're dyslexic and that's the reason why they have a recording device, they can just simply say to individuals that in order to make sure that the notes are accurate, and because it's quite challenging for me to be able to listen attentively and take notes at the same time, I'm going to use a recording device, if they've had the permission to do that, for example. And I think that whether an individual discloses or not, if an organisation has a really clear process of support in place and demonstrates that they're really neuro-inclusive, providing awareness training, then I think individuals will feel more confident about disclosing their neurodivergent condition if they feel safe to do so.
Yeah, that's some really good points there about making sure that it doesn't always have to go hand in hand with sharing maybe coping strategies or software which people are using, along with disclosing the diagnosis, and also the responsibility of companies to make sure that everyone feels safe and included. So thank you for just taking us back a few steps there, Daniel, to share that bit of information. in the meantime, we have had a couple of questions come in. A really good one, actually. I don't know who would be best to answer it, either yourself, Daniel, or Joe, but the question is, how would you best approach this subject with your employer when working from home? I don't know who, maybe Daniel, would that probably be best for you to discuss?
Yes, sure. So, if an individual is now working from home and experiencing challenges, and they feel that those challenges may be because of a neurodivergent condition, then what I would suggest is that they firstly try to find out if their organisation has a process of support for people that are neurodivergent, and whether they are able to arrange a screening, for example. So most organisations will have either an equality and diversity team or a HR team that sort of manage this process. So I would say, first of all, it would be to find out whether there is that process there or not, and if there is, then obviously they could follow that process. If there isn't a clear process of support for individuals, then it might be appropriate for the individual to discuss this with their line manager and explain that, now that I'm working from home, and I've noticed that I'm experiencing these challenges, and that I believe it could be related to dyslexia or another neurodivergent condition, and that now you know, I would like to try and seek some support and have a workplace needs assessment. You know, but again, I think it goes back to the point that the individual would need to feel confident about having that conversation with their line manager, and would need to feel safe to do so. So it is important that organisations ensure that they have a clear process of support, and that they can signpost individuals to appropriate people. So if the individual decides to have that conversation with the line manager needs to know who they can signpost them to in order to arrange some support for them. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think that should hopefully answer the question. Would you have anything to add, Joe, or do you say that covers the answer pretty well?
I'd say that certainly covers it, and Daniel's definitely the best person to answer that question.
Okay, cool. And then we have got one other question, which maybe come to you, Joe, because I feel like you touched upon it slightly at the start when we're giving the overview of Access to Work. But the question itself is, what kind of software or technology can Access to Work provide?
Okay, so there is there's a lot of software and technology that can support people with disabilities as a general thing, but obviously we've been talking more about neurodiversity, so I will just talk a little bit about some of the software available that can support individuals with neurodiversity or processing difficulties. So there is speech recognition software, and what that enables individuals to do is to dictate rather than write or type, and that can help individuals who struggle with spelling correctly, using the correct grammar and punctuation. There is mind mapping software, of which there are lots of different versions, but essentially what you see on the screen in front of you is a mind map. It can be used to help with lots of different issues, particularly planning, organisation of time, providing a structure for a large document. The other softwares, the other types of software that are available are text-to-speech software. So if an individual has a difficulty with reading, particularly comprehending or proofreading their work, then having it read to them can actually facilitate proofreading or getting the context of written information, which is something that people with neurodiversity can struggle with. There is also software available that can change the colour of the screen or the tint of the screen, or provide an underline or mask out bits of the software that you're not using, because as Daniel said, some people who experience who are neurodivergent can also have visual processing issues, so they find it very difficult to look at black text on a white background. There's also spell correction software that can automatically correct spelling, and there are several different devices and software that can also assist with difficulties with note taking. So those are really for people who are neurodivergent. There are also, for people, for example, with visual loss, you can have magnification software and screen reader software. So hopefully that answers that question.
Okay, thank you very much, Joe. I think you went through quite a long list there of everything which is available, and shows how, once again, the Access to Work scheme is basically there to help people with whatever needs they might need, and basically fulfilling the Equality Act to require an employer to make reasonable adjustments so that people can work to their fullest capability. We haven't got any more questions come through at the moment, so hopefully we were able to cover the Access to Work programme pretty comprehensively and made it clear to everyone. Thank you for everyone who joined us today, and also, of course, thank you very much to Joe and Daniel for helping us out and giving loads of great knowledge upon the subject. I hope you found it helpful, that you might now be a bit more well equipped to maybe apply for the Access to Work scheme or share information about it to others, so that it can go on and help others whilst in employment. Thank you very much for joining us today, everyone, and hopefully hear from you soon. Bye for now.